John Lewis lived a quiet life in a small town nestled between rolling hills and vast fields. He was a man of routine, someone who preferred the comfort of predictability over chaos. Every morning he woke up at 6 a.m., brewed himself a cup of strong black coffee and prepared for his job as a mechanic at a local garage. John wasn't rich, but he didn't need to be. His happiness came from simpler things: fixing cars with precision, spending time with his wife, Sarah, and watching their two kids grow up. To most people in the town, John was just another face in the crowd, unremarkable yet dependable. But beneath the surface of this ordinary existence lay a simmering tension that no one dared to address openly. The town had always been divided along racial lines, though few spoke about it aloud. Racism lingered like an unwelcome shadow, hidden behind polite smiles and forced pleasantries. For John, a black man living in a predominantly white community, this reality was something he'd learned to navigate carefully. Over the years, he had developed a thick skin, ignoring sideways glances and muttered comments whenever he entered certain stores or walked down specific streets. It wasn't easy, but John believed that if he kept his head down and focused on providing for his family, he could avoid trouble. Unfortunately, fate had other plans. On a chilly autumn evening, John's world changed forever. He had finished work later than usual, leaving the garage after sunset. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of fallen leaves, and the sky was painted in hues of orange and purple as twilight gave way to night. As he walked home, a journey that took him through dimly lit roads, he felt a sense of calm wash over him. The rhythmic sound of his footsteps echoed softly against the pavement, blending with the distant hum of crickets chirping in the fields. For a moment, everything seemed peaceful. That peace shattered when John noticed flashing red and blue lights in his peripheral vision. At first, he thought nothing of it. Police cars often patrolled the area, especially at night, and he assumed they were simply checking on someone else nearby. But then, the vehicle slowed down beside him, its tires crunching against the gravel road. Two officers stepped out, their faces stern and unreadable. One of them approached John while the other lingered near the car, hand resting casually on the holster of his gun. "Excuse me, sir," the first officer said sharply. "Can I see your ID?" John froze for a fraction of a second before nodding. He reached into his pocket slowly, careful not to make any sudden movements that might be misinterpreted. Handing over his driver's license, he waited patiently, expecting the routine check to end quickly. After all, he hadn't done anything wrong. He was just a man walking home after a long day's work. But instead of returning his ID, the officer studied it intently, his brow furrowing as though trying to find fault with every detail. Then came the accusation. "You match the description of a suspect we're looking for." John blinked in disbelief. A suspect? For what? He hadn't even heard about any crimes happening recently. Before he could ask for clarification, the tone of the interaction shifted dramatically. The second officer joined the first, his voice rising as he barked orders. "Put your hands where we can see them," he demanded, his words laced with aggression. Panic bubbled inside John, but he forced himself to remain calm. Slowly, he raised his hands above his head, palms facing outward. What happened next unfolded like a nightmare. One of the officers drew his gun, pointing it directly at John's chest. The barrel gleamed menacingly under the streetlight, casting a cold reflection in John's wide eyes. "Don't move!" the officer shouted, his finger resting dangerously, close to the trigger. Time seemed to slow down as John stood there, frozen in place. His heart pounded so loudly he was sure the officers could hear it. Fear gripped him like icy fingers, squeezing tighter with each passing second. He couldn't understand why this was happening. Hadn't he followed their instructions perfectly? Why did they feel the need to pull a weapon on him? Meanwhile, the second officer began searching John roughly, emptying his pockets onto the ground without care. Wallet, keys, loose change, all scattered across the pavement like debris. When nothing incriminating turned up, frustration boiled over. The officers exchanged glances, their expressions hardening further. Then came the insults, sharp and cutting. Racial slurs rolled off their tongues effortlessly, each word designed to strip away John's dignity. "You think you're smart, don't you?" one sneered. "We know you're kind." Despite the terror coursing through him, John managed to stay composed. Softly, almost inaudibly, he repeated the same phrase over and over again. "I haven't done anything wrong." His voice trembled slightly, but it carried a quiet strength. This only seemed to infuriate the officers more. They moved closer, their voices growing louder, their words more venomous. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. Neighbors began peeking out of their windows, drawn by the commotion. Some watched silently, too afraid to intervene, while others whispered urgently among themselves. Someone finally called 911, not to report a crime, but to document the abuse unfolding before their eyes. For John, those moments felt endless. Each breath was shallow, each heartbeat thunderous. He wondered if anyone would come to his aid or if he was truly alone. Would they shoot him right here on this deserted road? Would his family ever know what happened to him? These questions swirled in his mind, threatening to overwhelm him. Yet somehow John found the courage to stand tall, refusing to let fear consume him completely. Little did he know, this incident would spark a chain reaction that would ripple far beyond the confines of his small town. As the minutes dragged on, backup arrived, bringing additional officers and a tense atmosphere. The scene grew chaotic, with flashing lights illuminating the dark street and radios crackling with static. Despite the overwhelming odds stacked against him, John remained resolute. Though he didn't realize it yet, his ordeal was about to become a catalyst for change. A story that would inspire many and expose the deep-rooted injustices lurking beneath the surface of everyday life. As the backup officers arrived, the tension in the air thickened like a storm cloud ready to burst. The flashing lights of multiple police cars bathed the street in an eerie glow, casting long shadows that danced eerily on the pavement. John Lewis stood frozen, his hands still raised above his head, his heart hammering wildly in his chest. He felt exposed, vulnerable, and utterly powerless under the harsh glare of the headlights and the cold gaze of the officers surrounding him. Though more people had gathered, neighbors peering cautiously from behind curtains or standing silently on their porches, their presence offered little comfort. It was clear no one dared to step forward. The lead officer, the one who had initially drawn his gun, seemed agitated by the growing crowd. His grip tightened on the weapon as he barked orders at John, his voice sharp and cutting. "Don't move a muscle," he shouted, stepping closer until the barrel of the gun was mere inches from John's face. The second officer, meanwhile, continued rifling through John's belongings, scattering them further across the ground. Nothing incriminating turned up. No drugs, no stolen goods, not even a parking ticket. But this did nothing to ease the hostility radiating from the men in uniform. Instead, they grew angrier, their frustration boiling over into outright aggression. "You think you're innocent, huh?" The lead officer snarled, his tone dripping with disdain. "We'll see about that." Without warning, he shoved John hard against the hood of a nearby car. The metal was cold and unforgiving beneath John's cheek, and the sudden force of the push knocked the wind out of him. Pain shot through his ribs as the officer pressed down on his back, pinning him in place. "Stay still," the man growled, pressing harder, as though daring John to resist. But John didn't fight back. He couldn't. All he could do was grit his teeth and try to steady his breathing, praying silently that this nightmare would end soon. The other officers milled around, some watching impassively while others muttered amongst themselves. None of them stepped in to intervene, even as the abuse escalated. One of the newer arrivals, a younger officer with a nervous twitch in his jaw, glanced briefly at John before looking away, guilt flickering across his features. But he said nothing. No one did. They all stood there, complicit in the unfolding, injustice letting it play out without objection. For John, this silence was almost worse than the insults being hurled at him. It felt like the entire world had turned its back on him, leaving him alone to face the wrath of these men who wielded power recklessly. Time seemed to stretch endlessly, each second dragging on for what felt like minutes. The insults kept coming, relentless and cruel. Words like thief and criminal were spat at him with venom, but it was the racial slurs that cut deepest. Each hateful phrase struck like a physical blow, chipping away at John's dignity piece by piece. Yet, despite the torrent of abuse, he refused to break. Something inside him, a quiet strength born of years of enduring prejudice, kept him grounded. He repeated the same words over and over again in his mind. I haven't done anything wrong. It became his mantra, a lifeline keeping him tethered to reality as everything else spiraled out of control. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, one of the officers radioed dispatch to run John's information through their system. By now, the neighbors' whispers had grown louder, carried by the cool night breeze. Someone among them must have called 911 again, because moments later, another patrol car pulled up, this time carrying a sergeant. The arrival of higher-ranking personnel brought a subtle shift in the atmosphere. The lead officer, the one who had pointed the gun at John, straightened slightly, his posture stiffening as he addressed the newcomer. Suspect matches the description, he said gruffly, gesturing toward John. No ID yet. The sergeant frowned, glancing first at John and then at the scattered contents of his pockets lying on the ground. What exactly are we looking for here? He asked, his tone measured but firm. When none of the officers provided a satisfactory answer, the sergeant turned his attention to John. Sir, he said, addressing him directly, do you know why you've been stopped? John hesitated, unsure how to respond. His throat felt dry, his voice barely above a whisper when he finally spoke. No, sir. I don't understand. I was just walking home. His words hung in the air, simple and honest, yet heavy with unspoken emotion. The sergeant studied him for a moment longer before nodding curtly. All right, let's sort this out properly. Reluctantly, the lead officer holstered his gun, though his expression remained stony. With the immediate threat of violence diminished, John allowed himself a small, shaky exhale. But the ordeal wasn't over yet. The officers demanded that he accompany them to the station for questioning, claiming it was standard procedure. Exhausted and humiliated, John complied, knowing full well that resisting would only make things worse. As they led him to the patrol car, he caught glimpses of familiar faces in the crowd. Neighbors he'd waved to countless times, shopkeepers who knew his name, children he'd smiled at during school runs. Their eyes met his, filled with pity, anger, and disbelief. Some looked away quickly, unable to bear the sight of a man they thought they knew being treated like a criminal. At the police station, the interrogation began. John sat in a stark, fluorescent-lit room, his hands cuffed loosely around the back of a metal chair. Across the table, two detectives fired questions at him rapid fire, their voices overlapping and confusing. Where were you earlier today? One asked sharply. Do you own a black hoodie? The other chimed in. Why were you carrying cash? Despite the barrage of accusations, John answered calmly, sticking to the truth. He hadn't committed any crime. He had nothing to hide. Still, the detectives pressed on, determined to find anything that could justify their actions. Hours passed, and eventually, the truth became undeniable. John Lewis was not the suspect they were looking for. There had been no robbery, no stolen items, no credible evidence tying him to any wrongdoing. The so-called description they claimed matched him was vague at best, a black man wearing dark clothes which described half the population of the town. Realizing they had made a grave mistake, the officers released John with terse apologies that rang hollow in his ears. As he walked out of the station, blinking against the bright morning sunlight, he felt a strange mix of relief and despair. Yes, he was free, but the damage had already been done. News of John's arrest spread quickly throughout the community. By midday, social media platforms buzzed with outrage, posts and videos shared by witnesses painting a vivid picture of the injustice he had endured. Friends and family rallied around him, offering support and vowing to hold the authorities accountable. Among those moved to action was Sarah Thompson, a young journalist known for her fearless pursuit of truth. She reached out to John asking if she could tell his story. At first he hesitated, unsure if revisiting the trauma was worth it. But then he realized that staying silent wouldn't change anything. If anything, it would let the perpetrators off the hook. So with a deep breath and a steely resolve, John agreed. Sarah dove headfirst into her investigation, determined to uncover every detail of what had happened. She interviewed witnesses, reviewed body cam footage obtained through public records, requests, and pored over internal reports detailing past misconduct within the police department. What she uncovered painted a disturbing pattern: complaints of excessive force, discriminatory behavior, and unchecked aggression stretching back years. Officers involved in previous incidents had faced little to no consequences, emboldening them to act with impunity. Armed with this evidence, Sarah published a scathing exposé that sent shockwaves through the town and beyond. The article went viral almost instantly, sparking widespread condemnation and calls for justice. Protesters took to the streets, holding signs emblazoned with slogans like "Justice for John Lewis" and "Enough is enough." Community leaders organized town hall meetings, demanding accountability and systemic reform. The pressure mounted until local officials had no choice but to act. Investigations were launched and disciplinary hearings scheduled. For John, seeing the tide turn brought a sense of vindication, but also profound sadness. He knew that while his case might shine a light on deeper issues, real change would take time, effort, and unwavering commitment. In the days that followed, John found solace in the outpouring of support from friends, family, and strangers alike. People thanked him for speaking out, telling him that his courage had inspired them to confront their own fears and demand better. Slowly but surely, John began to heal, not just physically, but emotionally. He understood now that his experience, painful as it was, had given him a platform to advocate for something greater than himself. And though the scars of that night would always remain, he chose to focus on hope rather than bitterness. After all, sometimes hardship leads us to our greatest victories. The days following John Lewis's release from the police station were a blur of emotions: anger, fear, exhaustion, and an overwhelming sense of injustice. He returned home to find his wife, Sarah, waiting anxiously by the door. Her face lit up with relief when she saw him, but it quickly shifted to concern as she noticed the dark circles under his eyes and the stiffness in his movements. "Are you okay?" she asked softly, pulling him into a tight embrace. John nodded, though he wasn't sure if he believed it himself. Physically, he was unharmed, save for a few bruises on his ribs where the officer had shoved him against the car. Emotionally, however, he felt battered. Word of what had happened spread like wildfire through their small town. Neighbors who had witnessed the incident firsthand began talking among themselves, sharing stories of what they'd seen and expressing outrage over how John had been treated. Some even knocked on his door to offer support. "I can't believe this happened," one elderly woman said, tears streaming down her face as she hugged John tightly. "You're such a good man. You don't deserve this." Others left homemade casseroles or handwritten notes of encouragement on his porch. While these gestures brought some comfort, they couldn't erase the lingering pain of being held at gunpoint simply because of the color of his skin. Meanwhile, social media amplified the story far beyond the confines of their quiet town. Videos recorded by bystanders captured snippets of the ordeal. Flashing lights shouted commands, racial slurs, and quickly went viral. Hashtags like #Justice for John Lewis and #End Police Brutality trended across platforms, drawing attention not only locally but nationally. Journalists reached out, eager to document the case, while activists called for protests and rallies. The groundswell of support was undeniable, yet John found himself conflicted. On one hand, he appreciated the solidarity. On the other, revisiting that night felt like reopening a wound that hadn't fully healed. It was during this chaotic period that Sarah Thompson, the young journalist, entered John's life. She had built a reputation for tackling tough subjects with sensitivity and determination, and when she heard about John's story, she knew she had to act. After introducing herself and explaining her intentions, She asked if John would be willing to share his experience publicly. At first, he hesitated. Reliving the trauma seemed daunting, and he worried about becoming a target for retaliation. But then Sarah said something that struck a chord. "Your story has the power to spark change, not just for you, but for everyone who's ever felt powerless in the face of injustice." Her words resonated deeply with John. Over the next few days, he thought long and hard about whether to step forward. Conversations with his family helped sway his decision. His teenage daughter, Maya, spoke passionately about wanting to live in a world where no one else had to endure what her father did. "Dad," she said firmly, "if telling your story helps stop this from happening again, then you have to do it." Her conviction gave John the courage he needed. With a deep breath, he agreed to work with Sarah. Sarah wasted no time diving into her investigation. She started by interviewing witnesses who had been present during the arrest, piecing together a detailed account of events. Many described the officer's behavior as aggressive and racially motivated, echoing John's own recollections. One neighbor, Mrs. Jenkins, recounted how she had watched from her window, too afraid to intervene but horrified by what she saw. "I'll never forget the look on Mr. Lewis's face," she told Sarah. "He looked so scared, like he thought they might actually shoot him." Next, Sarah filed public records requests to obtain body cam footage from the officers involved. When the videos arrived, they painted a damning picture. The grainy footage showed John complying calmly with every instruction, raising his hands without hesitation and speaking softly throughout the encounter. In contrast, the officers appeared agitated and hostile, their voices rising unnecessarily and their actions escalating rapidly. One clip captured the moment the lead officer drew his gun, pointing it directly at John's chest despite the lack of any apparent threat. Another showed the second officer emptying John's pockets onto the ground, tossing items carelessly as though searching for evidence that didn't exist. Beyond the immediate incident, Sarah dug deeper into the backgrounds of the officers involved. What she uncovered shocked even her. Both men had histories of misconduct complaints, ranging from excessive use of force to discriminatory remarks. Internal review boards had dismissed many of these allegations due to insufficient evidence or procedural errors, allowing the officers to continue working without consequence. One particularly troubling report detailed an almost identical incident years earlier, where another black man had been detained under similarly flimsy pretenses. That case had also ended without charges, leaving the victim feeling helpless and betrayed. Armed with her findings, Sarah published a scathing expose in the local newspaper, accompanied by excerpts from the body cam footage and witness testimonies. The article laid bare not only the specifics of John's ordeal, but also the systemic issues plaguing the police department. It highlighted patterns of racial profiling, unchecked aggression, and a culture of impunity that allowed problematic officers to remain on the job. The piece concluded with a call to action, urging readers to demand accountability and push for meaningful reforms. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Within hours of publication, thousands of people shared the article online, amplifying its reach exponentially. Local news stations picked up the story, broadcasting interviews with John, Sarah, and community leaders. Protesters took to the streets holding signs that read, "Black Lives Matter" and "No Justice, No Peace." Crowds gathered outside the police station, chanting slogans and demanding answers. Some demonstrators even organized sit-ins, refusing to leave until officials agreed to address their concerns. Community organizations sprang into action, coordinating efforts to channel public outrage into tangible change. A coalition of civil rights groups, faith leaders, and grassroots activists came together to draft a list of demands, including independent investigations into police misconduct, mandatory de-escalation training, and increased transparency in disciplinary proceedings. They scheduled town hall meetings to discuss these proposals, inviting residents to voice their opinions and participate in shaping solutions. For the first time in years, there was a palpable sense of unity and purpose in the town, a collective determination to confront the injustices that had long gone unaddressed. Amidst all this activity, John found himself thrust into the spotlight. Friends encouraged him to attend rallies and speak at events, believing his presence could galvanize others. Initially reluctant, John eventually agreed, driven by a growing realization that his experience had given him a unique opportunity to make a difference. Standing before crowds of people who cheered his name, he spoke candidly about the fear and humiliation he'd endured that night, and the hope he now clung to for a better future. "I didn't ask for this," he admitted during one speech. "But if my story can help bring about change, then I'm ready to fight for it." As momentum continued to build, pressure mounted on local authorities to take action. City council members convened emergency sessions to address the mounting criticism, while police chiefs scrambled to reassure the public that steps were being taken to prevent similar incidents in the future. Behind closed doors, heated debates unfolded about how best to respond. Some argued for sweeping reforms while others resisted, citing budget constraints or concerns about undermining officer morale. Ultimately, the sheer volume of public outcry forced their hand. Investigations were launched, disciplinary hearings scheduled, and promises made to implement new policies aimed at fostering trust between law enforcement and the communities they served. For John, watching these developments unfold brought a mix of emotions. On one hand, he felt vindicated knowing that his ordeal had sparked such widespread awareness and mobilization. On the other, he remained acutely aware of the challenges ahead. Real change wouldn't come overnight, and there would undoubtedly be resistance along the way. Still, he chose to focus on the progress being made rather than dwell on setbacks. Each rally, each petition signed, each policy proposed represented a step toward justice, not just for him, but for countless others who had suffered in silence. As weeks turned into months, John's resolve only strengthened. He threw himself into advocacy work, partnering with organizations dedicated to ending racial injustice and promoting police reform. Together, they organized workshops, fundraisers, and educational campaigns designed to empower marginalized voices and hold institutions accountable. Through it all, John discovered a newfound sense of purpose. Though the scars of that fateful night would always remain, he refused to let bitterness define him. Instead, he channeled his pain into passion, determined to ensure that no one else would have to endure what he had. After all, sometimes hardship leads us to our greatest victories. As John Lewis stepped deeper into his role as an advocate for justice, the legal process against the officers involved in his arrest began to unfold. The momentum generated by Sarah Thompson's exposé and the subsequent protests had put immense pressure on local authorities to take decisive action. Prosecutors reviewed the case meticulously, poring over every detail: witness testimonies, body cam footage, internal police reports, and patterns of misconduct unearthed during Sarah's investigation. It became clear that this wasn't just about one isolated incident. It was a symptom of systemic failure within the police department. The charges filed against the two officers came as both a shock and a relief to John. The lead officer, the one who had drawn his gun and shoved John violently against the car, was charged with multiple counts including assault, unlawful detention, and civil rights violations. His partner faced lesser charges but was still held accountable for his role in the abuse. For John, seeing these men formally accused in court felt like a small victory, though it did little to erase the trauma of that night. "It's not about revenge," he told friends and family repeatedly. "It's about accountability." The trial began months later, drawing attention from across the country. News outlets covered every development, while activists and community members packed the courtroom daily. John attended each session, sitting quietly in the front row alongside his wife, Sarah, and their children. He listened intently as prosecutors laid out their case, presenting evidence that painted a damning picture of the officers' actions. Bodycam footage played on a large screen, showing John calmly raising his hands while the officers escalated the situation unnecessarily. Witness testimonies corroborated his account, describing how the interaction devolved into aggression and racial slurs. One neighbor even recounted hearing the lead officer mutter derogatory comments under his breath before pointing the gun at John. Defense attorneys tried to argue that the officers acted reasonably given the circumstances, claiming they were following protocol when stopping someone who matched a vague description, but their arguments fell flat in light of overwhelming evidence. Witnesses testified that no credible threat existed during the encounter, and expert analysts pointed out glaring inconsistencies in the officers' statements. A particularly powerful moment came when Sarah Thompson took the stand. With calm confidence, she walked the jury through her findings, highlighting not only the events of that night but also the broader pattern of misconduct within the department. Her testimony left many in the courtroom visibly moved, including John, who clenched his fists tightly to keep his emotions in check. Days turned into weeks as the trial progressed. Closing arguments arrived, and both sides delivered impassioned speeches. The prosecution emphasized the importance of holding law enforcement accountable, urging the jury to consider the wider implications of their verdict. "This is not just about one man or one night," the lead prosecutor declared. "It's about ensuring that power is exercised responsibly and fairly. If we fail to act now, we send a message that abuse will go unpunished, and that message has consequences far beyond this courtroom." The defense countered by attempting to cast doubt on the credibility of witnesses and downplay the severity of the officers' actions. They argued that mistakes happen and that punishing the defendants too harshly would discourage officers from doing their jobs effectively. Their words, however, seemed hollow compared to the mountain of evidence stacked against them. As the judge instructed the jury to begin deliberations, John felt a mix of anxiety and hope. He knew the outcome wouldn't undo what had happened, but it could set a precedent, a statement that no one, regardless of their badge or title, was above the law. Jurors deliberated for 3 tense days. During that time, John stayed close to home, spending hours reflecting on everything he'd been through. He thought about the fear he'd felt that night, the humiliation of being treated like a criminal, and the courage it had taken to speak out afterward. He also thought about the people who had rallied around him, his family, neighbors, strangers who had marched in solidarity, and journalists like Sarah who had risked backlash to tell his story. Their support reminded him that he wasn't alone in this fight. Finally, the verdict was announced. The courtroom buzzed with anticipation as the foreperson stood to deliver the decision. Guilty. The lead officer was found guilty on all counts, including the most serious charge of violating John's civil rights. His partner received a lesser sentence but was still convicted of aiding and abetting misconduct. Cheers erupted in the room, with tears streaming down faces as justice finally prevailed. Outside, crowds gathered to celebrate the ruling, chanting slogans and waving banners. Social media exploded with messages of triumph, hailing the verdict as a step forward in the ongoing struggle for equality and fairness. For John, the moment was bittersweet. While he felt a profound sense of relief, he couldn't ignore the lingering scars, both physical and emotional, that the ordeal had left behind. Still, he chose to focus on the positive impact the verdict represented. In sentencing, the judge delivered a stern rebuke to the convicted officers, emphasizing the gravity of their actions. "You swore an oath to protect and serve," she said firmly. "Instead, you abused your authority and inflicted harm on an innocent man. Today, we hold you accountable for betraying that trust." The lead officer was sentenced to several years in prison, while his partner received probation and mandatory counseling. Though some criticized the sentences as too lenient, others saw them as a significant milestone. For decades, similar cases had often ended without repercussions for those in uniform. This time, however, the system had worked, at least partially. Accountability had been achieved, sending a powerful message to law enforcement agencies nationwide. Unchecked power cannot be tolerated. In the weeks following the trial, John found himself reflecting on the journey he'd endured. From the terror of that autumn evening to the triumph of the courtroom verdict, his life had changed irrevocably. Yet, rather than dwell on bitterness, he chose to embrace the opportunities this experience had created. He became a vocal advocate for police reform, traveling to nearby towns and cities to share his story. At rallies and conferences, he spoke passionately about the need for transparency, accountability, and cultural sensitivity training, within law enforcement. His words resonated deeply with audiences, inspiring many to join the movement for change. John also collaborated closely with grassroots organizations working to dismantle systemic racism. Together, they pushed for legislative reforms, such as requiring independent oversight boards to investigate complaints against officers and mandating comprehensive diversity training programs. Slowly but surely, progress began to take root. Local governments passed new ordinances aimed at improving police-community relations, while schools introduced curricula focused on racial equity and social justice. These changes may have seemed small on the surface, but to John, they represented seeds of hope planted in fertile ground. On a personal level, John experienced growth too. Once hesitant to draw attention to himself, he emerged as a beacon of resilience and courage. Friends and family marveled at how far he'd come since that fateful night. His wife, Sarah, often joked that she'd always known he was strong, but now the whole world could see it too. Even his children looked up to him with newfound admiration, proud of the way he had transformed pain into purpose. "Dad," Maya said one evening as they sat together watching the sunset, "you're my hero." Her words brought tears to John's eyes, reminding him of why he continued to fight. Despite the victories, challenges remained. Not everyone supported the push for reform. Some residents grumbled about going too far or accused activists of targeting law enforcement unfairly. Resistance persisted, both overt and subtle, testing the resolve of those committed to change. But John refused to let setbacks deter him. He understood that progress rarely followed a straight path. It was messy, unpredictable, and often frustrating. Yet he believed deeply in the possibility of a better future, one where no one had to endure what he had. One evening, as John reflected on the road ahead, he realized something important. Justice wasn't just about punishing wrongdoing. It was also about healing wounds and fostering understanding. With this insight, he began reaching out to former skeptics, engaging in conversations designed to bridge divides. He visited schools, churches, and community centers, encouraging dialogue between residents and police officers. Some meetings were tense, filled with raw emotions and difficult truths, but others sparked genuine connections, planting seeds of empathy and mutual respect. Through it all, John remained steadfast in his mission. Though scars lingered, both visible and invisible, he refused to let bitterness define him. Instead, he chose forgiveness and progress, channeling his pain into purpose. Years later, when asked about his journey, John smiled softly, saying, "It wasn't easy, but sometimes hardship leads us to our greatest victories." And indeed, his story became a testament to the enduring human spirit, a reminder that even in the face of injustice, hope can prevail. Months turned into years, and John Lewis's life took on a new rhythm, one defined not by fear or resentment, but by purpose and action. The trial verdict had marked a turning point, not just for him personally, but for the entire community. What began as an isolated incident of racial profiling and police brutality evolved into a broader movement for justice, accountability, and systemic reform. For John, this journey wasn't about revenge or even vindication. It was about creating a world where such injustices wouldn't happen again. A world where people like him could walk home without fearing for their lives. In the wake of the trial, John threw himself wholeheartedly into advocacy work. He joined forces with grassroots organizations that shared his vision of equality and fairness. These groups worked tirelessly to push for legislative changes at both local and national levels. One of their earliest successes came when the town council passed a resolution requiring independent oversight boards to investigate complaints against law enforcement officers. This policy ensured that investigations were conducted impartially, free from internal bias or cover-ups. It was a small step, but to John, it felt monumental, a tangible sign that progress was possible. John also became a vocal advocate for education and awareness. He believed deeply that ignorance fueled prejudice, so he partnered with schools and community centers to develop programs focused on racial equity and social justice. Workshops were organized to teach students about systemic racism its historical roots, and how it manifested in modern society. Teachers incorporated lessons on civil rights history, using real-life stories, including John's own, to spark meaningful discussions. At first, some parents resisted these initiatives, claiming they were divisive or unnecessary. But John persisted, engaging directly with critics and inviting them to participate in open dialogues. Over time, many came to understand the importance of addressing uncomfortable truths head-on. His efforts extended beyond classrooms. John collaborated with faith leaders to host interfaith gatherings aimed at fostering unity and understanding. Churches, mosques, synagogues, and temples opened their doors to host events where residents of all backgrounds could come together to share meals, stories, and perspectives. During one particularly memorable gathering, a retired police officer stood up and apologized publicly for times he'd turned a blind eye to misconduct within his ranks. "I regret staying silent," he admitted, tears streaming down his face. "If I had spoken up sooner, maybe things would be different today." His words moved many in attendance, including John, who saw them as proof that hearts could change, even among those who once perpetuated harm. As part of his activism, John traveled extensively, speaking at rallies, conferences, and universities across the country. His speeches combined raw honesty with unwavering optimism, making audiences laugh, cry, and think deeply about their roles in shaping a better future. In one address delivered to a packed auditorium, he recounted the terror of being held at gunpoint and the humiliation of being treated like a criminal. Then, shifting tone, he spoke passionately about the power of collective action. "No one person can fix everything," he said firmly, "but each of us has a responsibility to do what we can. Whether it's speaking out against injustice, voting for leaders who prioritize reform, or simply listening to someone else's story, we all have a role to play." John's message resonated widely, earning him recognition far beyond his hometown. National media outlets profiled him, highlighting his transformation from victim to advocate. Awards followed, humanitarian honors, leadership accolades, and even a key to the city presented during a tearful ceremony attended by hundreds. While John appreciated the acknowledgement, he remained humble, insisting that the real heroes were the countless individuals working behind the scenes to drive change. "This isn't about me," he often reminded interviewers. "It's about all of us coming together to build something better." Back home, the ripple effects of John's advocacy continued to grow. Inspired by his example, young activists emerged, eager to carry the torch forward. High school students formed clubs dedicated to promoting racial harmony and challenging stereotypes. College graduates returned to the town after completing their studies, bringing fresh ideas and energy to ongoing projects. Together, they launched campaigns targeting specific issues such as affordable housing, healthcare access, and educational disparities. Slowly but surely, the community transformed, not overnight, but incrementally, piece by piece. One of the most significant victories came when state legislators passed a comprehensive police reform bill inspired by recommendations drafted locally. Among its provisions were mandatory de-escalation training for officers, stricter guidelines for use of force incidents, and increased transparency in disciplinary proceedings. To celebrate the achievement, John organized a massive rally in the town square. Thousands gathered, waving banners and cheering as speakers took turns thanking everyone involved in the effort. When it was John's turn to speak, he stood quietly for a moment, taking in the sea of faces before him. Then, with a voice thick with emotion, he said, "Tonight, we honor what we've accomplished. But tomorrow we keep fighting. Because true justice is never finished. It's a journey we take together." Despite the progress, challenges remained. Resistance to reform persisted in certain quarters, with some accusing advocates of undermining law enforcement or exaggerating problems. Tensions occasionally flared, particularly during heated debates over proposed policies. Yet John refused to let negativity derail the momentum. Instead, he doubled down on building bridges, reaching out to skeptics with patience and empathy. He met regularly with police chiefs and union representatives, discussing ways to improve relations between officers and the communities they served. Some meetings ended in frustration, while others yielded promising breakthroughs. Through it all, John maintained his belief that dialogue and trust could overcome division. On a personal level, John found solace in the love and support of his family. Sarah remained his rock, cheering him on through every triumph and comforting him during moments of doubt. Their children, now teenagers, grew increasingly proud of their father's legacy. Maya, in particular, became deeply involved in activism herself, organizing youth-led initiatives and mentoring younger kids. Watching her blossom into a confident leader filled John with immense pride. "She's going to change the world," he told friends, his eyes shining with admiration. Years later, looking back on everything he'd been through, John realized how much he had grown, not just as an activist, but as a person. The man who once feared drawing attention to himself had become a symbol of resilience and hope. Scars still lingered, the memory of that terrifying night etched permanently into his mind, but they no longer controlled him. Instead, they served as reminders of why he fought so hard, to ensure that others wouldn't have to endure similar pain. When asked about his journey in interviews or casual conversations, John always offered the same reflection. "Hardship doesn't define you," he'd say thoughtfully. "How you respond to it does, and sometimes the hardest moments lead you to your greatest victories." His story had become a testament to the enduring human spirit, a reminder that even in the darkest times, courage and compassion could light the way forward. Today, John Lewis is remembered not merely as a man who survived injustice, but as someone who transformed it into fuel for change. His name appears in textbooks, documentaries, and speeches honoring trailblazers who dared to challenge the status quo. Schools bear his name, murals depict his image, and generations continue to draw inspiration from his unwavering commitment to justice. But perhaps the greatest tribute lies in the lives he touched, the countless individuals who learned to stand taller, speak louder, and dream bigger because of his example. In the end, John's legacy isn't confined to laws passed or awards won. It lives in the hearts of those who refuse to accept inequality, who believe in the possibility of a brighter tomorrow, and who understand that true strength comes not from anger, but from hope. For John, that realization brought peace, a quiet certainty that despite everything, his fight had been worth it. After all, sometimes hardship leads us to our greatest victories.